Is Iran becoming another forever war?
15th and 16th among U.S. service members in the war with Iran. The U.S. has all blockade on Iranian ports.
This is why PBS, this is why you sponsor PBS with your voluntary subscriptions, okay? Because you get tomorrow's news today, you get the next hour's news right now. That's why the Piker Broadcasting Service is sponsored by you, the people, for you, the people, and nothing but the people. I am here to serve. The People's Broadcasting Service is entirely funded by your voluntary contributions. Please subscribe. And if we get to level 10 hype train, we get to level 10 hype train, we'll carry the flame. We haven't.
To halt its shipments of crude oil. Iran's supreme leader, in response, issued a statement calling Donald Trump's signature on the Memorandum of Understanding, which initiated the now broken ceasefire, quote, worthless and invalid, end quote, and suspended the agreement. The latest round of strikes is ominous. They include attacks by the U.S. on Iranian desalination plants, which remove salt from seawater, and power plants that provide the electricity to carry out water production. Iran has responded by bombing desalination plants in Kuwait, where U.S. warplanes are based. Nations in the Gulf rely almost exclusively on desalination plants to provide fresh water. In Kuwait, about 90% of drinking water comes from desalination, along with roughly 86% in Oman and about 70% in Saudi Arabia. There are hundreds of desalination plants situated along the Persian Gulf. The water supply for millions of people is within range of Iranian missiles and drones. Should the targeting of desalination plants continue, it will trigger a humanitarian crisis. Iran has once again closed, for the most part, the Strait of Hormuz to shipping. U.S. bases in the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan have been attacked. Iran has called on their Houthi allies in Yemen to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait should the U.S. attack Iran's power infrastructure. This would block all shipments out of the Gulf, including oil from Saudi Arabia. Trump's escalation is a huge gamble for the United States, whose strategic petroleum reserve has fallen to its lowest level since 1983. Its stockpiles of missiles and interceptors are also being exhausted. After initially projecting that the war would cost $29 billion, the Pentagon is now saying it needs $80 billion. Once indirect costs, such as increases in food and fuel prices, are added, the cost to consumers and taxpayers is about $132 billion and rising. Where do we go from here? Will the steady escalation ignite a regional war? What will the renewed fighting do to the global economy? And will a negotiated settlement at this point even be possible? Joining me to discuss the latest round of fighting in the Middle East is Professor John Mearsheimer. He is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Professor Mearsheimer, who graduated from West Point, was a captain in the U.S. Air Force. He is the author of numerous books, including Conventional Deterrence, Nuclear Deterrence, Ethics, and Lydell Hart and the Weight of History, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, The Israel Lobby, and U.S. Foreign Policy and Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics. So, John, before we began, you made a point that last night the United States apparently did not attack infrastructure within Iran, and you suggested that the Iranian attacks on desalination plants and oil facilities, we should add, in Kuwait, as well as the two bases in Kuwait that are staging areas for U.S. warplanes, may have functioned as a kind of deterrence. I just wondered if you could address that.
Yeah, let's just talk about the big picture here. This tit-for-tat strategy that has been going on for over a week now started on July 7th. And this past week, early in the week, President Trump made it clear that if the Iranians did not surrender by the end of this week, that he would then go after civilian infrastructure in Iran. He'd go after bridges, he'd go after power plants, and so forth and so on. But what happened was that at the end of this past week, he started, or the United States started, to go after civilian infrastructure. We went after bridges, we went after power plants, and we went after a desalination plant.
I think the goal for this was to basically cut off routes of transit that the military would use, the Iranian military would use to get to Keshem Island and potentially create an environment where America could invade some of the Iranian coastline, specifically in the southern part of Iran. I mean, it's still a war crime. It's still unacceptable. I'm just trying to explain to you what their reasoning is for why they were targeting critical infrastructure like this, that civilians were using, land bridges, and the like. You just made that up? I made that up. Really? You think I made this up? What's your goal here? What's your opinion here? You think they were just blowing up one specific area's bridges that connects it to the rest of the country? Like, they're doing war crimes, yes, but they're also doing it for a specific military purpose, okay? This doesn't make the war crimes appropriate, especially when the easier route to take would be to implement the memorandum of understanding that they already had at the table. You kind of just shape events to your narrative sometimes, man, Law. I explained this to you when they did this at the time, when they were hitting these bridges. I explained it at the time as well. It's not just my narrative. There are far smarter individuals than myself that I read that also have a similar assessment. Chatters will come in here and be like, how dare you do analysis? I came here to just what? Watch me go based over other people's commentary?
Inside of Iran. Now, what the Iranians did was they instantly retaliated against similar targets in countries like Kuwait. Furthermore, they ramped up the bombing campaign against Jordan, and they bombed Saudi Arabia for the first time in almost 4 months. So they made it clear that they were going to play tit for tat. Moreover, the Iranians made it clear that next week, if President Trump went after civilian infrastructure in a big way, they would basically shut down the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf and out of the Red Sea and out of the United Arab Emirates, which has a very important port that's located outside of the Strait of Hormuz. All of this would be shut down. And furthermore, the Iranians would go after all sorts of power plants, desalination plants across the Middle East. So the Iranians made it clear that they were playing hardball. Now, when you look at these threats in the context of what the Iranians have actually been able to do over the past few days, in terms of hitting various targets in Jordan and in other places in the Middle East, it's manifestly clear that the Iranians have the capability to target all sorts of infrastructure inside of these Middle East states and do great destruction. And both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have run articles in recent days about how effective the missile strikes are. So I think what has happened here, Chris, and I'm just saying I think this is what happened, is that last night, which is Saturday/Sunday night, the American retaliation against Iran did not include civilian infrastructure in any meaningful way. They did not go after bridges. They did not go after power plants. They did not go after desalination plants, which they had been doing. We had been moving in that direction, but that stopped last night. And the question you have to ask yourself is, number one, why? And number two, is that a harbinger of what we think will happen in the coming week? Now, my guess is that it stopped last night because the Gulf states called up President Trump and said, you absolutely cannot go after civilian infrastructure inside of Iran, because if the Iranians retaliate, they will destroy our societies. They will wreck our power plants. They will wreck our desalination plants. And it looks like, again, just looks like Trump listened. And then that raises the question, what will Trump do this coming week? Because he has promised that he is going to unleash the dogs and go after all this civilian infrastructure in Iran. But he now knows what the consequences of that will be.
Well, he's so mercurial. Of course, it's very dangerous to predict. He could very well bomb civilian infrastructure tomorrow night. One senses he's flailing about. Of course, the entire war on Iran was built on a fantasy that didn't come to fruition, fed to him largely by Bibi Netanyahu. But it doesn't appear that there's any real strategy other than an escalation of force. And I think the naive hope that that will make the Iranians bend. But you may have another take on that.
Well, I think you're right that he signed the MOU on 17 June. And as I've emphasized on numerous occasions, on numerous platforms, that was a surrender document.
Yeah.
The Iranians won on every point. Then, after signing the agreement, he decided to challenge the Iranians on the whole question of who controls the Strait of Hormuz. To me, it was very clear from Article 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding that Iran controlled the strait in the 60-day negotiating period. And then moving forward, control of the strait would be settled between Iran and Oman. That was the deal. There was nothing about the United States controlling the strait. But what President Trump tried to do was open a U.S.-dominated channel in the Gulf that got around Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranians said, unsurprisingly, this is unacceptable and it violates Article 5. And I'm just saying, I think this is what happened, is that last night, which is Saturday/Sunday night, the American retaliation against Iran did not include civilian infrastructure in any meaningful way. They did not go after bridges. They did not go after power plants. They did not go after desalination plants, which they had been doing. We had been moving in that direction, but that stopped last night. And the question you have to ask yourself is, number one, why? And number two, is that a harbinger of what we think will happen in the coming week? Now, my guess is that it stopped last night because the Gulf states called up President Trump and said, you absolutely cannot go after civilian infrastructure inside of Iran, because if the Iranians retaliate, they will destroy our societies. They will wreck our power plants. They will wreck our desalination plants. And it looks like, again, just looks like Trump listened. And then that raises the question, what will Trump do this coming week? Because he has promised that he is going to unleash the dogs and go after all this civilian infrastructure in Iran. But he now knows what the consequences of that will be.
Well, he's so mercurial. Of course, it's very dangerous to predict. He could very well bomb civilian infrastructure tomorrow night. One senses he's flailing about. Of course, the entire war on Iran was built on a fantasy that didn't come to fruition, fed to him largely by Bibi Netanyahu. But it doesn't appear that there's any real strategy other than an escalation of force. And I think the naive hope that that will make the Iranians bend. But you may have another take on that.
Well, I think you're right that he signed the MOU on 17 June. And as I've emphasized on numerous occasions, on numerous platforms, that was a surrender document.
Yeah.
The Iranians won on every point. Then after signing the agreement, he decided to challenge the Iranians on the whole question of who controls the Strait of Hormuz. To me, it was very clear from Article 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding that Iran controlled the strait in the 60-day negotiating period. And then moving forward, control of the strait would be settled between Iran and Oman. That was the deal. There was nothing about the United States controlling the strait. But what President Trump tried to do was open a U.S.-dominated channel in the Gulf that got around Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranians said, unsurprisingly, this is unacceptable and it violates Article 5. Confident that he could basically throw the MOU under the bus and he could engage in a tit-for-tat military strategy with the Iranians where the United States would win. In other words, he seemed to believe that we had newfound coercive leverage over the Iranians after signing the June 17th MOU. But this is delusional. Nothing has changed in the dynamics of the conflict, as we have seen over the past week or so. The Iranians have a formidable missile and drone capability, and there's nothing we can do about it. And the idea that we have a newfound advantage over the Iranians.
It's actually worse. So not only do we not have a newfound advantage that Donald Trump thinks we have, or is operating like he thinks we have, but we actually have a bigger disadvantage this time around, because the whole purpose behind the MOU, even in the most charitable estimations, if we're to assume that like these guys know what they're doing and it was deliberate, the MOU was actually fake, it was a concoction to normalize the oil prices, that would be the most charitable to the administration, right? Like they didn't have any intentions of following through on it. They just wanted a moment of respite. If that's the strategy, then that comes with the recognition that America has less leverage now than it did before the MOU, because that recognition is now the strategic petroleum reserves are diminishing to a degree that is critical. Okay? That's the problem here. So it's actually worse. Not only do we not have the military capabilities, not only do we not have any military leverage, like any military coercive capabilities against Iran, we actually have less time and less opportunity to even continue militarily engaging Iran because the strategic petroleum reserves are about to collapse.
Iranians now that we didn't have when we signed the June 17th MOU agreement makes no sense at all.
Well, the irony is that there was huge opposition from the hardliners in Iran to essentially agree to this MOU, and that's.
I worry that this is going to go up the escalation ladder, and then Trump is going to do something crazy. Congratulations to Spain for the goal, by the way. I worry that Trump is going to let like the Israelis nuke Iran or something. I do worry about that a little bit.
Raises the other issue. If there is a negotiated way out, it isn't going to look like the MOU, which was a surrender document. It's going to look a lot worse for the United States because the MOU was predicated on phases. At this time around, the Iranians are going to demand that they have about $100 billion in frozen assets. They're going to want that a release. They're going to want a lot of stuff up front.
I agree with that. I mean, there's no question that the moderates won with regard to whether or not Iran should sign the MOU on June 17th. The hardliners said, don't sign it, you can't trust the Americans. But the moderates prevailed, and then the hardliners proved to be correct. So they're now in the driver's seat as best we can tell. And it seems to me, given that we don't have any military strategy for defeating Iran, that we're going to, at some point, have to move to a memorandum of understanding number 2. And it will be the hardliners, not the moderates, who are in the driver's seat. And as I think you correctly point out, those hardliners will push forward a tougher deal for Trump to swallow. I would imagine that in addition to your point about them wanting all of those frozen assets up front, they will also demand that the Israelis get out of southern Lebanon. If you look at Article 1 of the 17 June MOU, it dealt with Lebanon. And it was very clear from that memorandum of understanding, and the mere fact that the Lebanon issue was the number one issue on that agenda, that the Iranians really do want the Israelis to stop bombing Hezbollah and to get out of southern Lebanon. And it could be, one can't tell for sure, but it could be that the Iranians will demand that happen before they sign a memorandum of understanding. And this, of course, will put Trump in an extremely difficult position because, as we both know, the Israelis have no interest in getting out of southern Lebanon. But the problem that we face here is that the Iranians, I think, probably have more leverage now than they had before the June 17th agreement. I would note, Chris, that I said, not publicly, but I said privately to a number of friends who I go back and forth with on this whole issue, that I thought the Iranians were foolish to sign the 17 June Memorandum of Understanding. I've long believed that the longer the war goes on, and the more oil that's cut off from the Gulf, the better off the Iranians are. And just to elaborate on that a bit, and this will put some meat on the bone when it comes to talking about what might happen this coming week. You want to remember that there were about 20 million barrels per day coming out of the Gulf on February 27th. You know, when people talk about 20% of the world's oil came out of the Gulf, that 20% represents about 20 million barrels. And since the war started, we've devolved to a situation where 7 million barrels are still coming out of Saudi Arabia and the UAE combined. So it's only, in my opinion, about 13 million barrels that have been bottled up in the Gulf. Now, where are those 7 million barrels coming out of? One is that Saudi Arabia is sending probably somewhere on the order of 5 million barrels out through the Red Sea, not through the Strait of Hormuz. And I would guess that the UAE is sending out close to 2 million barrels from Fujairah, which is a UAE port on the Gulf of Oman. In other words, it's outside of the Strait of Hormuz. So you have this roughly 7 million barrels of oil, 7 million out of the original 20 million that are still coming out of the Persian Gulf. I think the Iranians have a vested interest in shutting down the flow of oil through the Red Sea. That's the Saudi Arabian oil and shutting down Fujairah. And there's some evidence they've already shut down Fujairah, because this will worsen the oil situation, the global oil problem that the United States and the rest of the world faces. So if the war goes on and the Iranians are able to shut down the Red Sea, which they're threatening to do, and also shut down and keep shut down Fujairah, this will work to their advantage. It will give them more coercive leverage. So all of this is to say, Chris, if Trump does up the ante this coming week and goes after civilian infrastructure inside of Iran, the Iranians will retaliate by shutting down almost completely the flow of those 7 million barrels of oil that are now coming out of Saudi Arabia and probably the UAE as well.
Let's talk about Israel. Israel has not carried out strikes in this latest round, and Iran has refrained from attacking Israel, although they did, I think the Iranians attacked the port of Aqaba, which is, of course, very close to the Israeli border. There were Israeli officials who objected to the fact that American refueling planes were stationed in Israel. Netanyahu had to override them. Let's talk about the wild card of Israel. If Israel gets pulled back into this, it does feel like Armageddon at that point.
Well, the Israelis definitely want to stay out. They'll let the Americans wage this tit-for-tat campaign. I would imagine.
Yeah. Because remember, the conditions have not changed for the better for Israel. By the end of the MOU, Iran was successfully hitting Israel by way of Hezbollah, but also directly with their own ballistic munitions. And the impact and the frequency of successive and successful hits was far higher, which means that the Israeli defensive capabilities had diminished. This is precisely the reason why it is not in Israel's best interest to join this round of attacks alongside the United States of America, because Iran will retaliate. They've shown that they will retaliate. And not only that, but Iran also retaliated against Jordan now. For the 8 days, Iran has been pummeling their Jordanian anti-air defense systems. And not only that, but they're also pummeling the Jordanian offensive capabilities as well. This has made Israel's vulnerability even larger.
Imagine if a major air war started again, which is extremely unlikely. The Israelis would willingly participate. But I think the Israelis understand at this point that if they get involved in the fight now, if they get involved in the tit-for-tat conflict, then they become a giant magnet for Iranian missiles. The Israelis are surely watching what just happened in Jordan, what's happening in Kuwait, what's happening in Bahrain, and what the Iranians are promising to do in the UAE. And they fully understand that Iranian missiles invariably get through the defenses. Maybe a few of those defensive missiles, those Patriots, will knock down an incoming ballistic missile. But most of the ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and drones that the Iranians fire at those Gulf states get through. And they will get through in Israel as well. We now know that the Israelis were not very successful in shooting down Iranian ballistic missiles and drones during the 40-day air campaign, which ran from February 28th to about April 8th. Israel really got pounded, and the Israelis don't want to get pounded again. So they're perfectly content to sit on the sideline and let the Americans wage.
If Argentina strikes again, guys, you have to understand, if you're playing against Argentina, you have to do double the amount of goals. Okay? First goal always gets eliminated by FIFA. Then the second goal, they have to literally recognize. The third goal, deleted again. Fourth goal will be recognized. That's just how it is. You have to double up in your scoring. And then you have to be extra careful, because there's also the other side of it. Because when it's 1-0, if you don't actually get it up to 2-0, in the last second, they will also find a penalty for Messi. If you get in the box, if you get an Argentinian player in the box, it's going to be a penalty. I'm calling it. I'm not jinxing it. Stop being superstitious. I'm just telling you. It's pre-watch Piker, okay? I don't even need to know that much about football to understand how Infantino's operation works, okay? Take off the jersey. Okay, calm down.
This tit for tat strategy.
The other issue is that the accuracy of the Iranian missiles and drones has increased exponentially from the inception of the conflict back to the 40-day conflict, largely because I think they're using, or it's assumed they're using, Chinese and perhaps Russian satellite systems.
Yeah, it's not just the accuracy, Chris. It's also the missiles. In many cases, many of the ballistic missiles can maneuver as they're coming down toward the target, and that enables them to dodge or avoid the missile defense systems that the Gulf states and Israel have. And I think maybe most important of all, it appears that both the Chinese and the Russians are supplying Iran with excellent intelligence as to where the key targets are. So in other words, it's not just the accuracy. It's not just that they can, put these missiles in the pickle barrel. It's also the fact that they know which pickle barrels to hit, because either the Russians or the Chinese or both of them are providing them with excellent intelligence. And, the maneuverability, the accuracy that you mentioned, and the intelligence information, you combine all those things with the fact that they have ballistic missiles that have powerful warheads, and you can see where they can do one heck of a lot of damage. And they are doing one heck of a lot of damage. And again, we don't want to underestimate that they're promising to do even more damage. And when you see what they have done up to now, and you think about the promises, you begin to say, these are credible promises. And this is why at the start of the show, I was saying to you that I think that this is why President Trump did not go after civilian infrastructure last night, and why he, and I want to underline the word might not go after civilian infrastructure this coming week. Although, as you pointed out, he is flailing around. And I think your use of the word flailing is exactly the right word. He is flailing around, and he is in desperate straits. So nobody knows for sure week. But it does seem that if basic deterrence strategy or basic deterrence logic kicks in, that he probably won't go up the escalation ladder this week.
How much damage has Iran inflicted on U.S. bases in the region? It's all classified, so we're kind of groping.
Well, it's quite clear from what you read in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And these are newspapers that are deeply dedicated to the American cause. It's not like these are pro-Iranian newspapers, but it's quite clear what you read from these newspapers that we have suffered an enormous amount of damage on our bases. Usually the rhetoric in these newspapers is that almost all of the bases have been either badly damaged or destroyed. And of course, the Iranians have continued to go after those bases in places like Kuwait and Bahrain. The 5th Naval Headquarters are at Bahrain, and the Iranians have continued to pound those headquarters and that naval base more generally. They've continued to bomb all sorts of U.S. targets in Kuwait. Now, very importantly, Chris, just recently we started bombing Jordan. And the question you want to ask yourself is, why are we now bombing Jordan when we hadn't been bombing Jordan for most of the war?
You mean Iran? Iran is bombing Jordan.
Yes, I'm sorry. Iran is bombing Jordan. Why is Iran bombing Jordan? And the answer...
Motherfucker said we. Oop. A mistake. A mistake that I also try not to make. You can tell. You can tell which side this man is on by his Shia smirk. Look at him. Look at him doing the Shia smirk. Even Chris is doing the Shia smirk a little bit. A little baby Shia smirk from Chris.
The answer is that we have moved lots of military assets to Jordan because they are so vulnerable in places like Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, and so forth and so on. So Jordan has become an important staging area. Well, the Iranians responded by going after U.S. targets in Jordan. And this is why they ended up killing 2 American servicemen. They've also, it appears, wounded many other American servicemen. They've attacked one base and destroyed a significant number of Black Hawk helicopters. And they have attacked the main U.S. air base in Jordan as well. And they are...
Our man Chris has resting bureaucrat face. Yes, he has resting Politburo face, which is funny because he hates the USSR. But he would be... He would be like the Secretary of Agriculture in some faraway oblast in the USSR. You know what I mean? He really does look like that. Do not give this man bad news from the production line. Yes. I'm glad that it is 5 minutes, not rooting for Messi, but just because I like the drama. No, end it. End it now. End it now.
To continue those attacks on Jordan. And what the Iranians are basically saying, there is no place to hide. Wherever you go, we're coming after you. And you want to understand that we have a lethal missile, and drone force, and we will use that force in very effective ways. And they have demonstrated quite clearly that they have that capability.
A lot of the air attacks have been concentrated in southern Iran. And there's been speculation that this is because the United States is considering seizing parts of Iranian territory, some of the islands, perhaps Karg Island. I don't know how they would do it. I guess they would have to do it by air. I'm not sure how that would work. Certainly they can't do it by ship. I think the Boxer is their amphibious, and that's 200 miles away or something. But how do you see that as a possibility, and how would it play out?
Well, I'll make a couple points, Chris. First of all, you have to ask yourself, how many, here we're talking mainly about infantry and Marines, U.S. Army infantry and Marines, combat troops, people that you can use for an amphibious operation. How many troops of that sort do we have in the Gulf? Now, you'll see in the media, people say there are 50,000 American troops in the region. That's true, but those 50,000 troops are not all combat troops. And in my opinion, most of them are not combat troops. My guess is that there are at the most 8,000 Marines and Army troops from the 82nd Airborne in the region. About 8,000 combat troops at most. What are you going to do with 8,000 troops? That's a tiny number of troops. If you're seriously talking about invading a country like Iran that has 93 million people, a formidable military, represents a huge piece of real estate. I mean, this is a big territory that it covers, has forbidding terrain. What are you going to do with 8,000 troops? Not only do you have to invade with those 8,000 troops, you have to sustain them, and then you have to reinforce them. This is just not in the cards. And if you listen to President Trump talk, he says that it's not going to be American ground troops that do the invading. It's other troops from the region that are going to do the invading, the ground operation.
Hold. It's so funny that most of the chat is second screening the game. And then there's like people that are in Maine that are like, bro, Troy Jackson basically clinched up Troy Jackson is going to be the fucking candidate in Maine. No one is listening to Professor Goatheimer. Okay. It's crazy. All right. Let's get back to Goatheimer versus.
So I scratch my head and say, well, who is that? Are they going to send in the IDF? No. I mean, they're bogged down in southern Lebanon, and the Israelis are too smart to invade Iran. That's not going to happen. So who's going to do it? And it looks like, if anybody, it's going to be the Kurds coming out of Iraq who invade Iran. But the Kurds are not going to do that unless they're crazy. And if they do invade, it's not going to have any meaningful consequence. The Kurds are our ground force option? This is not serious. 8,000 troops in the region are a ground force option? I don't think so. Furthermore, if President Trump were foolish enough to try and seize an island or to land somewhere on the coastline of Iran, many American soldiers would die. This would be a highly dangerous operation. The Iranians would go to great lengths to retaliate and drive those American forces off the beaches. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what does the cost-benefit analysis look like for President Trump? There'd be zero benefit, right? What is he going to gain by invading an island or, establishing a beachhead on the Iranian coast? What are the gains from that? I don't see any. And the cost is that many Americans will die in what almost everybody will see as a futile military operation. And he'll pay an even greater political price.
Yeah. Considering that there is no way to reassert military dominance over Iran as it stands currently, and considering the reality that every day that goes on, every day that continues, every day that this war wages on is worse for America overall, worse for the rest of the globe overall. There's nothing that they can do about it. There's nothing. They're going to keep risking bigger and more military assets. They're going to keep risking bigger actions. They're going to keep risking more military assets and potentially put more troops' lives at risk as well.
For that. So why would he do that? So I don't see any ground force option. You know, Chris, just to elevate for a second here, we started with a strategic bombing.
The only way would be ground invasion, and that's not happening. Dude, there's no guarantee that the ground invasion would actually hold either. Because in order to actually do a successful ground invasion, you can't just like invade militarily the coastline of Iran or the islands of Iran, right? You have to invade the rest of Iran too at some point. And in order to do that, we don't have the sufficient number of troops amassed or even drafted to be able to militarily dominate and engage in a permanent military occupation over the entire Iranian nation state. It's just not going to happen. And as far as the current predicament, there's no supply line to Keshem Island. There's no supply line to Karg Island. Even if they were to defeat the conventional force on the ground, they would not be able to establish a supply chain with any of the military bases in the region, because Iran has been destroying those military bases with ease. So it's all fucked.
Campaign that lasted 40 days. It failed. We were running out of munitions, and despite all the talk about all the damage we were doing to Iran's missile and drone capability, that proved not to be true. So we quit after 40 days. Then we went to the blockade. That lasted just a little over 2 months. And then we quit when we signed the memorandum of understanding because the blockade didn't work. Then Trump welched on the deal on the June 17th memorandum of understanding, and we started engaging in this tit for tat war, which we're now involved in. And that's not working, as we've just talked about. That's not working. The one thing we haven't done, oh, by the way, we have actually reinstituted our blockade. We're back to the maritime blockade as well, which didn't work last time. But on July 14th, President Trump reinstituted the naval blockade. So we have that at play now with the tit for tat. But it looks like the tit for tat's not working out very well as we talked. So people are now talking about using land power. We've used air power, we've used naval power, that didn't work. Let's use land power. This is not a serious option. If it was a serious...
As much as I dislike Kirky, he didn't want the Iran war. No, I know. But it doesn't matter. He didn't like fucking Jeffrey Epstein either. But he shut the fuck up real quick when Donald Trump made the boss call. If you think Charlie Kirk wouldn't be spending every damn day, if he was still alive, if you think he wouldn't be defending, being one of the... If you think he wouldn't be spending every damn day defending the Iran war, you're delusional. Okay? Charlie Kirk's primary goal was to be the regime propagandist on the independent media side. Okay?
Option. We would have tried it a long time ago. We didn't try it a long time ago because it doesn't stand any chance of working. The point is, Chris, we have no military option here. This is why Trump signed the June 17th MOU, because we had no option. The Iranians were winning the war. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, have the dynamics changed since then? Is there evidence that the United States has turned the tide and that we now have found a theory of victory? The answer is clearly no, unless you and I are missing something and they have some secret strategy in mind that they haven't told us about. And I don't think that's the case.
Isn't there always a temptation to go back to LBJ and the Vietnam War when it was clear, and it was clear fairly early on in the Vietnam War, that the United States in serious trouble? Then you get the heavy bombing campaign of North Vietnam. This fantasy that the escalation of force is going to solve your problem has been characteristic of these imperial adventures in Iraq, Afghanistan, and as I said earlier, in Vietnam, although it's not tethered to reality.
Well, a couple of points on Vietnam. First of all, there's no question that the Johnson administration, starting in March of 65 is when the bombing campaign began, big time. This is rolling thunder. And then shortly thereafter, we put combat troops. This is on March 8th, 65. We put combat troops for the first time into Vietnam. And we escalated and escalated up until March 31st of 1968. You remember very well that that's when LBJ, who was the president, said that he was not going to run for another term. He was clearly a defeated man.
Guys, I can't watch the World Cup. Are you kidding me? I can't. I can't watch the World Cup ceremony. I don't want to get fucking chatters. We cannot watch anything FIFA related. Okay? You understand that, right? You understand that, right? Like, there's nothing we can watch FIFA related. Yes, I saw that I'm in this Israel ad. Yes, Israel put me in a fucking AI ad that played during the World Cup. I know, I'm going to get to it. There's so much real news to cover that I can't. It's getting to a degree, it's getting to a point where like real politics, like John Fetterman threatening to leave the Democratic Party because of me, is now drama in comparison to like what I need to cover, which is real shit taking place. You know, America's possible military invasion of Iran. Like, and the same goes for like back in the day, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, if there was an AI ad that a foreign adversary or a foreign country made of me, I would cover that for like an hour. There'd be a huge story for me. And it has happened already. Russia did it first. Literally, Russia did this already. Russia called me a homosexual Twitch streamer who likes posing in front of nice cars, as opposed to the brave Russian military operative who dies in the fucking front lines in the grayest village of all time. Yeah, Russia did that to me years ago. And now Israel is doing it as well. So it's not, I don't know. I just don't have the fucking bandwidth anymore, man. Yeah, they said I drink banana smoothies as a homosexual Twitch streamer who likes wearing a lot of jewelry and posing in front of nice cars.
We had failed. Now, it's very important to understand that all along the way, from March 65 up until 68, the key decision makers, including Johnson himself, did not have a lot of faith in the military option that we were pursuing. They were desperate, but they were well aware that there were tremendous limits to what we could do against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong with military force. They were not wildly optimistic. Nevertheless, they escalated. And I think that you see a similar situation here. I think after the initial bombing campaign failed, after about 2 weeks, we understood that we were in a very difficult position. I believe that we will eventually discover that the key policymakers inside the administration understood pretty early in this war that we did not have a good military option. Nevertheless, we've escalated. And this is exactly what happened in Vietnam. There's no question that the leaders understood that we did not have a good military option, but they escalated. And as you remember, we ended up with about 530,000 combat troops in Vietnam. Just think about that. 530,000 combat troops in Vietnam by March of 68, when Johnson decided that the war was a lost cause. And he stopped the bombing campaign. Of course, Nixon and Kissinger then came in, and they thought that maybe they could find a way to win the war. Nixon said that he had this secret plan to get out of the war, but not really. What he really wanted to do was see if he could greatly reduce the American military commitment and we could still win the war. But of course, that didn't happen. And we were forced to quit, just like that was in 72, of course, we quit. And what happened with Johnson is he quit in 68. And if you look at Trump and what happened, he quit once on June 17th. And I think what's going to happen here is he's going to be forced to quit again. Not altogether unlike what happened in Vietnam. Again, Johnson wanted to quit March 68, and Nixon was eventually forced to quit at the end of 72. We just had no military strategy for winning against Vietnam. We had no military strategy for winning in Afghanistan. We had no military strategy for winning in Iraq.
With the exception of World War II, where it became an existential threat, especially for the USSR and all of the other countries that were being dominated militarily by the Nazis, there's a reason why America has never really seen a victory since then. Because until it becomes an existential war, there's no reason for, America's ambitions are never going to be fully realized. And even World War II, if you look at it from that reductive approach, was existential for other countries, not necessarily the United States of America, even though the United States of America obviously was a pivotal ally. I'm not taking away from that. But I think simply put, people fight till their last dying breath if they have something to lose. I mean, the first Gulf War was successful. I don't even bring that up because that's not real. You know, it's like saying Grenada, the Grenada invasion, you know, like America has had a lot of successful operations, especially covert ones. Like the CIA has really carried American imperialism for the last almost 100 years. I'm talking like a real war. You know what I mean? Not that doesn't like that we're attacking our own asset at that point. It just seems silly to bring that up. It's like saying Venezuela was a war that we won, you know? This, on the other hand, is a middle power, right? Iran is a middle power, but it's a regional power nonetheless. What happens to be a very important region for the rest of the world. Okay? Iran controls a critical route that 20% of the world's oil and gas goes through. So, even as a middle power, Iran is capable of making America suffer, making the rest of the world suffer, and therefore making America suffer. And at some point, we have to realize that America doesn't fight wars to win them. America fights wars to continue those wars. America fights wars for key sectors in its economy. But in this circumstance, America has to win. And because it's incapable of winning, you arrive at this endless military quagmire. All of the other failed wars that were long-lasting, 20-year occupations, all of those initiatives, they did not have a compounding effect on the rest of the world. They did not end up damaging the world's energy infrastructure. They did not end up creating economic issues for the rest of the world, right? 20 years in Vietnam, sure, it has regional effects, but it doesn't impact Europe. The global war on terror has some consequence for Europe, refugee crisis, but ultimately, most of the oil fields remain intact. They exchange ownership. They're sold off to Western oil and gas companies. And it's actually decent for that. It's actually good for the American oil and gas industry. They don't even stop selling oil in Iraq to China. They continue selling oil to China. It's just now the people that are profiting are not the Iraqi people or the Iraqi government necessarily, but instead Western companies. This is different. I've been saying that from the first day onward. This is different because the rest of the world is suffering now, is suffering directly due to American intervention. And there's only so much suffering that America can get other people on board with until they start to push back.
We have no military strategy for winning here. But your point is that once you get into these things, very hard to get out, no question. And you look for ways to escalate. And it's kind of like a wing and a prayer. You know, maybe something will happen that we don't foresee. And if we just double down, maybe, you know, we'll be lucky. And I think there's just a lot of that going on. I think that's what President Trump was thinking after June 17th. He figured that memorandum of understanding I signed, it's a surrender document. I really don't like it. I'm sure the Israelis and the Israel lobby and neoconservatives and the hawks in the United States were telling him he made a mistake signing that June 17th MOU. And he probably said, let's try something else. Maybe if I go back to, you know, putting pressure on the Iranians, I can get them to cut a deal. And here we are. But again, there is no deal to be had, just as there was no deal to be had in Vietnam. If you took 5 of the smartest strategists in the United States and you could ramp back in a time machine to March of 1965, and you told those 5 strategists, it's your responsibility to come up with a brilliant strategy to win the Vietnam War, the end result would be the same. And if they were really brilliant strategists, they would have told LBJ not to go in. And if he had nevertheless gone in, they would have told him to immediately get out, because there was no way to win the Vietnam War. We had no theory of victory. And again, I think that most of the policymakers at the time understood that.
Well, who's advising Trump? That's the question. You know, he doesn't have a McNamara. Whatever you think of McNamara, he was.
Who's advising Trump? Benjamin Netanyahu. That's clear to me. I don't know if that's far-fetched to say, but Benjamin Netanyahu, Foundation for Defending Democracy, and numerous other Israel firsters that are in his immediate, that's who's advising him. It used to be Lindsey Graham, and he's dead now, but his spirit still remains in the room.
Competent, although, of course, led us into disaster in Vietnam. But that's the question. He's surrounded by sycophants and people like Stephen Miller. I don't know if Miller is involved in this, but of course he has no military training. And that's that. And Trump seems to be able just to decide unilaterally. I mean, Congress did pass a resolution with Republican support saying any more strikes on Iran had to be cleared through Congress that, of course, Trump has just blithely ignored.
Well, it's very hard to say, who exactly is whispering in his ear. And it's also hard to say whether he listens to anybody. It seems from the outside that the key force for restraint, the person, who was sort of acting like McNamara, and just to be clear, McNamara figured out quite quickly that we had no winning strategy in Vietnam. He did not act this way when he spoke publicly. He was full of confidence when he talked publicly about the war. But it's quite clear now that behind closed doors, he understood that we just did not have a winning strategy. And I think if there's anybody in the administration who fits that bill, it's J.D. Vance.
That's big fucking wrong. No. Okay. We found it. Area of disagreement with the GOAT. Hate to see it happen like this, but I vehemently disagree with my GOAT. Mearsheimer is wrong. J.D. Vance is not a reliable advisor to Donald Trump. Okay? J.D. Vance is a non-entity in the room. J.D. Vance is a careerist. J.D. Vance is simply a placeholder so that Donald Trump can continue taking advantage of the techno-feudalist fascist billionaires that see J.D. Vance as their guy in the room, specifically Peter Thiel. Trump does not like J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is a surrogate for Peter Thiel. Trump understands that. And J.D. Vance has no capabilities of influence in the room, especially considering. Dude, what the fuck's going on with Twitter? Twitter's been going crazy.
Quite clear that Vance was hardly enthusiastic about this war to begin with. He had real doubts, and it appears that he advised against it. And he has been the point.
No. I don't agree with this. J.D. Vance is an empty suit. J.D. Vance does not have a real ideological position on this war. This is complete hokum. Sorry. That is not real. J.D. Vance is not an anti-interventionist. J.D. Vance is not anti-war with Iran. J.D. Vance is simply positioning himself as that because he has further ambitions. He has ambitions for higher office. He can read the room a little bit, but of course, he is incapable. He doesn't have a consistent stance on this. He's not. You can see it. Yeah, Chris Hedges, his response is my response. Okay, that's how I feel about this take. I mean, you can hear it with J.D. Vance's own words, with what he tries to leak to the media, presenting himself as like being in opposition to the Iran war. But clearly when he's in the room, he's like, oh, we got to go big or go home. All of this stuff is bullshit. He's a flip-flopper and he's not being serious. He's not sincere. I don't believe J.D. Vance actually has a different opinion. Most people also hate him for this reason, because he's not consistent.
Man, for dealing with the Iranians. I mean, he is the person who met with the Iranians with regard to getting the 17 June MOU in place. So it looks like Vance is the person who is telling Trump that it makes sense to cut a deal here. And as we all know,
he refused to leave again. No, that's crazy. It's especially crazy to do this to Spain, a country that he fucking hates. God, he's such a fucking loser. At least he's on the edge, so it'll be easier to fucking edit him out. You know what I mean? He's got to ruin everything, man. He's got to ruin everything. Everything he touches dies.
Vance has basically said publicly that he thinks that the Israelis and their supporters in the United States have been going to great lengths to sabotage the 17 June MOU and any future negotiations that might put an end to this conflict. So Vance looks like one person who's pushing in the right direction. I don't know what to make of Witkoff and Kushner. I wouldn't be surprised if Witkoff was telling him pretty much the same thing that Vance is. I would guess that Rubio is saying exactly the opposite. You want to remember, Chris, that what Rubio and Vance say on this issue has significant implications for their chances of being the Republican presidential candidate in 2028. I'm sure Vance understands that by being appointed the point man in dealing with the Iranians and working to negotiate a deal with the Iranians, Vance is not going to endear himself to the Israel lobby and to the hawks in the United States, and they will go to great lengths to make sure that Rubio, not Vance, is the Republican candidate in 2028. Viewers should remember that when President Trump was thinking about appointing a vice president for his 2024 run, the two choices were Rubio and Vance barely won because there was a huge amount of pressure from people like Rupert Murdoch to make Rubio the vice presidential candidate, but Vance won out in the end. And these two individuals will surely be in a head-to-head competition for the 2028 nomination of the Republican Party.
Dude, JD Vance doesn't have a position. JD Vance does not have a real position. JD Vance is a surrogate for Peter Thiel. And I don't think Peter Thiel has a real commitment to ending this war anyway. The only reason why JD Vance is positioning himself as a advocate for isolationism is because he's positioning himself for what comes after. Okay? It's just empty. It's just empty posturing. That's all this is. So not only does he not have a real opinion, he is incapable of having a real opinion. That's not his goal. His goal is to be an empty vessel for whatever Peter Thiel wants. But also on top of that, like even if Peter Thiel was like, oh, I want you to be anti-war, I don't think he would have a lot of motion in that room. I just don't fuck one way or another what JD Vance thinks. Donald Trump is aware that JD Vance is a Peter Thiel blood boy. He's in the room because Donald Trump wants to maintain favorable posture with the likes of Peter Thiel and the techno-feudalists for one reason or another. I don't know if that's the smart calculation for him or whatever the fuck it is, but clearly that's his goal, right?
For the presidency. And I think how the two of them act on this whole subject of dealing with Iran and working out a memorandum of understanding really matters for that purpose. I don't think it's any surprise that you don't see Marco Rubio, deeply involved in dealing with the Iranians. He surely understands who's buttering his bread, and he's trying to stay as far away as he can from getting involved in those negotiations. And of course, from his point of view, it's advantageous that it's Vance who is involved. But I do think Vance understands that we cannot win this war, that we have to cut a deal. And that from his point of view, but I think more importantly, from Trump's point of view, I think Vance believes that from Trump's point of view, the best thing that could happen here is just to cut a deal and put an end to this, accept the fact that we lost and walk away.
I mean, how much time do we have left before the global economy craters? It's already pretty stressed out, the shortages of cooking oil.
Because Rubio's running Venezuela. I already explained this to you. Marco Rubio's goal is to be the viceroy of all Latin American operations. It's a much cushier job. It's a much easier job. JD Vance is on janitorial duty over in the fucking Iran fiasco. That tells you how Donald Trump treats both of these individuals. That tells you what Donald Trump thinks of either of these guys. Donald Trump doesn't fuck with JD Vance. If he did, he wouldn't be holding him responsible for, his failures in Iran. He sent his ass out there to make him hold that L, the MOU, and the fact that the memorandum of understanding would not work out. He knew full well that he had no intentions of creating a permanent and resilient peace. He just sent JD out there I mean, probably JD also understands that that wasn't going to happen regardless, but it looks good for him. He can position himself as like someone who was trying to keep the peace, and unfortunately failed to do so because Iran was just not interested in negotiations or whatever, you know?
In India, fertilizer, helium for microchips. I had read before the memorandum of understanding that some economists were saying by July that if there wasn't an opening of the strait, we could head for a global depression. And as I mentioned in the introduction, the strategic reserves have been heavily depleted, and not just in the United States, countries like Japan as well. How much more time do we have?
Let me tell you how I read the oil situation. I think what's happened is that with a set of workarounds, we have been pretty successful at minimizing the damage that has been done so far. And there are three major workarounds that I see. First, as I told you before, of the 20 million barrels that used to come out of the Gulf, 7 million are actually still coming out. So when people say that the flow of oil out of the Gulf has been completely cut off, those 20 million barrels have been completely cut off, that's not true. 7 million are coming out through Yanbu and Fujairah. That's Yanbu in Saudi Arabia and Fujairah in the UAE. And furthermore, as you know, the canal has been, the strait has been opened up at different points. And some ships have come out when that strait was opened up, including Iranian ships. So the 20 million barrels have not completely disappeared. That's one point you want to keep in mind. The second point is, and this is quite remarkable, the Chinese have greatly reduced their demand for oil by about 5 million barrels a day. It's amazing how they've done that, and how they've done it, we're not sure.
Yes, we are. We are sure. It's because they no longer have the same reliance for oil and gas, and they just maintain the strategic petroleum reserves, partially because they want to, at the end of the day, keep the market stable, and they're using it right now. It gives them tremendous leverage as a major buyer, especially in moments like this. But also, the only reason why they're capable of doing this is because of green energy. They've electrified their grid. They use renewable energy in their infrastructure. The reason why, this is another area of disagreement with my goat, where he is far too much of a China hawk. He's definitely gotten a lot better in like the last decade or so, but I think Mearsheimer has always been Mr. Offensive Realism, and he's always had a very negative approach to China. So I think that's clouding his perspective a little bit.
But the fact is that...
Yeah, they have massive oil reserves. They've been using more coal because they always had that infrastructure. But a big part of the reason why they don't have to offset that and can just like kick coal in is because most of their energy grid, they have a big chunk of their energy grid also has renewable energy.
The Chinese demand for oil has gone down 5 million barrels. So when we talk about those 20 million barrels coming out, there's 5 million, right? 5 million that are not needed because the Chinese have reduced their demand, and there's 7 million that are coming out from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And then getting back to what you were mentioning, there's all that oil that's been released from the strategic reserve. And that adds up to another maybe 3 million barrels a day, as best I can tell. So when you add all these things together, you can see that we have been able to weather the crisis in the Gulf reasonably well up to now. Now, what scares people is that the strategic petroleum reserve is running down, and we're running out of oil that's available in that strategic reserve to world oil markets. Furthermore, there is the danger, as I was talking about before, that Fujairah and Yanbu will be completely shut down, and then there'll be no oil or hardly any oil coming out of the Gulf. And then there's the Chinese demand for oil, which is the wild card. What if the Chinese all of a sudden decide that they need more oil, and the demand for oil from China begins to go back where it was on February 27th? If those three things happen, then you're in deep trouble. but it's hard at this point to say exactly how this plays itself out. I mean, for example, if President Trump continues the tit for tat campaign this coming week, and he doesn't go after Iranian infrastructure in the process, he doesn't go after Iranian bridges and power capabilities or power stations, then maybe the Iranians will not shut down the Red Sea, and maybe oil will start to come out of Fujairah, or will continue to come out of Fujairah. I'm not sure whether Fujairah is completely shut down at this point. And that really matters for the overall question of oil supply. And then what the Chinese do is just very hard to say. So all of this is to say we're in a sense flying blind here.
I mean, really, it sounds like there are two roads that we can take. One, if the United States does continue to attack infrastructure, we are headed for a humanitarian disaster in the Gulf. If it doesn't, then it leaves open the possibility of some kind of a negotiated settlement that is even more advantageous to Iran than the Memorandum of Understanding. Are those the two kind of scenarios that face us?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't. Again,
I think this is major leverage for China. It's a great opportunity for them to engage in soft power. They also kind of have to do it once again because they need stability for their development. They have their own domestic economic problems if they can't consistently produce commodities for other countries, also in the Asian market as well. And if their economies tank, then the Chinese economy is going to feel it too. And that's part of the reason why they once again bailed the United States of America out. They don't make risky plays. That's just not how they operate. And that's it. Yeah. They want the Strait of Hormuz to open, obviously. They need the same precursory chemicals that are coming out of the Gulf, right? Even if they don't have the same level of reliance on like oil and gas, maybe they can swap out their energy grid for coal, which they're, going back to, sure. And they've also reduced their reliance on fossil fuels overall with their renewable energy grid. This is a opportunity to maintain stability, generate some goodwill. And also it gives them tremendous leverage because once they fucking increase their purchases again, they could just explode the markets. Prices would skyrocket instantly. It would get to hold on to.
I don't see a land invasion as feasible or as turning the tide. I don't think we have any meaningful theory of victory at this point in time. And I think what's happening here is that we have this tit for tat strategy or tit for tat campaign taking place between the United States and Iran. And the question is, how does it play itself out? And I think we'll know a lot a week from now.